Hey, hi Jessica, how are you?
I'm good. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, I'm at my church office, and it's funny because it's usually really quiet, but it's like, okay, well, the day I'm recording something, like a few of the staff kids are here, like almost like just how it works, I guess.
I co-edited a book with a colleague here, and so I'm using this old office. So it looks like I don't read.
Well, that is certainly not the impression I have of you, so you are totally safe.
Okay, so tell me about your book and why it is that you're excited to put it together.
Yeah, so for me, it just felt like the book that I've always wanted to read, of just sort of like thinking about African American literature in light of and in conversation with just, yeah, Christian theology and our faith and what it means to follow Jesus, and like merging those worlds and how they enrich one another. And I just like when I remember the first time coming to like some of the books that I love and some of the books that I cover in my book, like Native Son or Invisible Man, and just reading them and like just thinking like, wow, like what, like how do I think about this as a Christian? Like, what is it like? How does the gospel speak to these sort of circumstances, characters, and dynamics? Like, what would Jesus say to bigger Thomas, and all those sorts of things? And so, for me, the book is a chance to kind of do that. And I just think of like kind of the call and response dynamic between the concerns in African American literature and the truths of Christianity, and like how for a lot of our national history, obviously those truths have been suppressed. Right? There's been manifestations of Christianity that have not spoken to those things intentionally or out of blindness. But there are answers, and I think our faith is enriched by looking at the questions of those authors, and vice versa. So that's really like, this is just the book that I've always wanted to read, and it feels like the only book that at this point I'm really like engaged and qualified to kind of write on. And so that's kind of where it's come from.
So a lot of the great African American writers that I'm familiar with, many of them were protesting the faith, right? I mean, especially 1920s to 40s, weren't they seeing it as the white faith and really disassociating themselves from it? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think you see that in, for example, Native Son. There's when Bigger's arrested, there's sort of the his mom wants the preacher to come, and the preacher comes, and like kind of with the preacher, there's this long whole thing of what the preacher says, and Bigger's like, what is this? Doesn't make any sense. And I think that's right, kind of trying to show some of the just kind of the impotent nature of what is presented as Christianity to people in this sort of suffering. So I definitely think that is a component of it. But then on the other hand, you have somebody like Baldwin, who, despite all of his, prophetic critiques, still is like holding out this hope and this sense of like, hey, if we really return to this ideal of love, that then there's hope here. And so I think it's sort of both. But I think even those authors that were strongly protesting sort of these Christianity as a suffocating force towards African Americans. Those are critiques that we really need to hear, and really need to engage and need to engage with, and we're become better and more whole in our faith and our understanding through that sort of engagement. So I try to do both of those, and I know we're going to talk about Hurston a little bit, and I think she's kind of in that category too, where it's like this was not, though she grew up around the faith, this was not something that she claimed, or in some ways even looked on necessarily favorably. But I think there's still lessons from her work that can enrich how we live as disciples.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Hurston. So I dove into Zora Neale Hurston because just like James Baldwin, when I was in graduate school, I actually created this list of Southern literature that dealt with religious themes. And so Go Tell It on the Mountain, Moses, Man of the Mountain, they almost seem prophetic, like outside of their
Hmm.
time. There's just so much universal, there's these enduring questions there that I don't think I wrestled with even, 15 years ago, that I'm wrestling with now. So when you look at someone like Hurston, for example, her dad was a Baptist pastor,
Hmm.
right? And so she grew up with this, as you said, the call and response. I mean, really, the way that I've come to understand her work is almost like it's saying, can I get a witness?
Hmm.
From
Hmm.
conviction. So, what is her relationship with the faith that she grew up with, or maybe how did that look later in her life?
Yeah, I mean she has explicit kind of disavowals and problems with the faith, but what I think is really fascinating about her in that novel is just the even the desire to approach scripture and to like use scripture to recast and tell this story. And I know, from seeing, some portions of your work that on that I thought was outstanding, is just sort of the prophetic imagination that you talk about. And just to me, I think there's something really instructive that even somebody who's saying, I'm outside of this, is still coming to this text and saying, I'm going to participate in this. And there's really something there. So when I think about that novel in particular, I really think about, what it means to participate in scripture. And there's sort of, obviously she has continuity and some pretty strong discontinuity as well. But I think like even both of those things are really fascinating, really instructive. And I think just like the audacity to do that like says something about the value of the scriptural text, and like why we need to imagine, why we need to consider questions like how do we participate in God's story, like what does it mean to step into the Exodus and this idea of God who wants to set people free, and God who's at work in the world. And though she answers some of those in some ways that are really different, there's still just asking that question is so crucial and so important.
Do you find her work? I'm afraid that people are going to find her work blasphemous. Just
Yeah.
like if I can set up a little
Yeah.
context, I mean, she's writing this novel in 1939, and so people a lot of times read it from our perspective, and they see connections with the Nazis. And was she writing against fascism? Was she writing for a Mussolini type character? Was she writing against God? I mean, where would you place her? I don't think it's a fiction work that you could just hand someone in a congregation and say, this is going to lead you to Jesus.
Right. She talks about, I think it's in the little foreword, like, Africa has its mouth on Moses. So she's like kind of breathing in just these kind of mythologies and this sort of folklore tradition, regarding Moses, and sort of like this real big kind of blend of the Exodus narrative in a biblical sense and also just in a folkloric sense. And she couldn't write the novel the way she wrote it without really knowing the actual like biblical text. Like it's pretty impressive. Like I was sort of challenged myself. I was like, wait a second, like I need to go I need to go back and reread Exodus and Numbers, and like she's really like working at a close level. But at the same time, there's so many major departures, and sort of God is minimal in the novel. Moses is really the figure of power. She makes changes in terms of even kind of the allegorical component of it, like Israel. They don't really they don't really know God. So Moses is like the missionary to the people. Like there's these really significant changes that I think would throw people for a loop. And to me, I think she's kind of asking, it feels like she's making all of these changes for many reasons, but I feel like one of the things that I take away is sort of this end component in the novel where Moses is reflecting, and it's sort of this idea that liberation doesn't come through one person, but it has to be internalized. One person can't set a people free. A people have got to desire this from their heart. Everyone has to participate in this work, and I feel like that's sort of what she's sort of the one of the driving themes that she's getting at is like, let me retell this story about this one figure that liberates, and let me push this and make this provocative to try to tell the story about like we've got to set ourselves free. And that's an interesting thing, and I think there's some components there that we can say, there's truth there that we need to bring into conversation, and under the apostolic deposit of our faith. So that's kind of what I go to. I go to that real section, which I think you touch on as well in your chapter in a really helpful way too.
Right. You've mentioned a couple times my chapter is on prophetic imagination. And so I'm definitely looking at this revelation in which someone becomes a prophet by receiving a different way of viewing the world than they had previously. And this revelation is what frees them to then invest their power for the powerless, right? And that's what prophets do in scripture. And of course, I think that's what Hurston is doing. But as you just mentioned, the difficulty I have, the tension I have, and maybe this is just like the philosopher coming out in me, but you're a theologian, so probably the same idea is like, who frees Moses?
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah.
much in the narrative that troubles me because it's like, I believe in internal liberation. I believe in freedom of the soul to then help other people be free. I don't believe I can free myself.
Right.
And that's where she gets on such sticky ground. How can we read her profitably when it seems like that's such a disjunction from what scripture tells us about freedom?
Yeah. Yeah. I think we just have to mark that out as a major, place of discontinuity, a major place where we would just say, yeah, like we can't go there. There's no freedom there, right? There's no life there. So if we recognize we're starting with our understanding of freedom in a different sense, then I think there's some profitable things we can take from the novel. Um, for me, like I think about the story, as I mentioned, like the participation angle. And yeah, I just think of like, I think like the Exodus story is something historically that like people have participated in a lot of different ways. They've reappropriated it in a lot of different ways. And I feel like her novel helps us to just say, hey, here's the way, like the fact that she makes the allegory to sort of put African peoples in the place of Israel, which is obviously something that is a major part of the Black Christian tradition, right? That's how it starts. But I think it's such a helpful counter to the way so much of white Christian denominations historically put themselves in the place of Israel, right? And in the place of Israel, but not as a sufferers, but as like God's chosen people. That sort of supersessionism that Willie Jennings talks about in the Christian imagination. And so she's countering that. And I think just by the fact that she does that, like to me, it's like this book is so valuable. And she does it in some really cool ways where like even just like in some humorous ways too. I think it's the other thing I like about the novel. There's some humor there. So like, when Moses is kind of like arguing and beefing with with his kind of rival related to Pharaoh, there's sort of like, I can beat you up, and like, that your mama knows, and all this sort of stuff. And it's just fun. And so she lets through vernacular, through that folklore tradition, she helps the descendants of African peoples see themselves in the Exodus story, and which is the opposite of the way historically we've been told to see ourselves in the biblical story, but only in this lens, not as the people that God cares for, that God is going to deliver. We had to do that for ourselves. And so because I see that as such a strong tie, I'm very inclined to sort of just like recognize like the goodness of the novel. But I think all the things that you're bringing up are really important. And I think we have to acknowledge those. Otherwise we can't see the novel, we can't benefit from it in the sort of fullness that we want to.
You're definitely highlighting what I find the reason I keep coming back to the novel. Because even with all of its problems theologically and the strongman figure that, especially at the end, I start having a real antagonism to. Like, I stop liking Moses about halfway through
Mm,
the book.
mm,
But in the beginning, I really enjoy it because it's the
yeah.
defamiliarization that happens where a story of the Bible became too familiar to me that it almost wasn't true anymore. Like I made it
Yeah.
weak by making it too familiar. And then the way she breaks it up, she makes it funny. She brings it to life. You get to see this connection between Moses and African American preachers, between the Israelites and the slaves in America. Like she really changes the way we see ourselves in the narrative, and that to me is worth picking up the book no matter
Yeah.
what.
Totally.
That defamiliarization process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's like that is so, and I think it's sort of like, for readers to kind of wrestle with some of the major points of discontinuity that we're talking about earlier. I think, being prepared to understand that, having a way to kind of grapple with that will allow a reader to enjoy and to like to experience some of what you're talking about, and I can see where that the sort of major changes, major shifts, the sort of decentering of God, all these sort of things would be sort of that first stumbling block that, if you don't know how to work with that, you're not going to step into some of the beauty that I think is in the novel as well.
Well, and Alice Walker, when she was trying to revitalize Hurston within like the great works of African American literature and kind of bring her into the fold, and she said that every Black writer needed to read Moses Man,
Mm,
which is an astonishing claim because
yeah,
other African American writers didn't find anything worthwhile in the novel, and even Hurston herself said,
totally.
I think I messed up writing this book. But what Hurston seems to do different than some other authors when she's protesting is she's not only protesting just race, but she's protesting or like the ways that you falsely categorize race, but she's protesting the ways you falsely categorize people ever.
Mm, mm,
Right? I mean, you see this way that she's not just, there's not an allegory. It's not an allegory between
mm,
blacks and whites in America. It goes so much deeper than that.
yeah.
The way that we just judge one another, and that we're always going to find a reason to say these people are better than these people.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see that with Miriam and Aaron. There's yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because this was what was the exact date of this release?
1939. Yeah, it was right when
Yeah.
Hitler's like marching into Poland and hating the Polish, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So 39. So 10 years before that, you have Passing by Nella Larson, which deals with some of these ideas of the colorism dynamic, the sort of like the in-house discrimination among African Americans that you see that, and she captures in Moses a little bit with sort of like a Miriam and all that stuff, which I think fits with some of her philosophy of like talking about the issues of race, but also like understanding the ways that this permeates beyond that, and I think that's pretty fascinating too. And again, to me, that's another place where it's like, well, here's some of the like the fascinating, fruitful kind of thematic realities in this novel that are there. When we could pass, if we can navigate some of the other challenges too.
Yeah, I think that's what makes the novel to me more universal than anything because it's part of
Yeah.
nature that we're never going to stop judging one another. We're never going to stop trying to create false hierarchies with one
Hmm.
another, just dependent on where it is and how we create these, whether it's gender
Yeah.
or class or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about so I'm thinking about Christian readers again, and mostly when I think of Christian readers, I imagine like I'm trying to talk to those outside of Catholicism. I'm normally talking to those who've been raised in kind of these fundamentalist homes who have not read a lot of literature and maybe are also very uncomfortable with the fantastical, the magical, the mythical. And that's what Hurston does in this text. What would you say to, like, if you were talking to those in your congregation about why to read this book, what would you say about their fears concerning the way that Hurston deals with magic in this text?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just do what you do with Harry Potter. I mean, it's like, what's the big deal? Like, we love Harry, we love Hermione, we love, all this stuff. So, so I think it's the same category. If we can't do that with this, that's sort of like trying to think through, the real experiences of just of not just people in America, but just sort of humanity and just sort of like in those sort of realities. If we can't do that, then I don't know. I don't know what to say. So I guess to answer your question, I can't help. I cannot help. I just think it's I guess maybe the more helpful thing, and I hope I don't mean that in any like mean way. I think maybe the more helpful thing is just we're a novel is a novel. It's not a one for one theological text, even if they're like working even if they're working with the scriptures, like we can recognize the places where like, oh, they're coming from this angle that obviously does not fit with what we know historically of our faith. And I think we can just recognize that for what it is, right? Like we're not going to come to this novel and begin preaching messages from it. We're coming to engage human experience, right? The way we do with story. And so I think we come in that perspective. I think then we can deal with that. And I think it's all just a realization, like you know yeah, we like yeah, I'll take the novels that deal with the magic and the fantastical versus the stories in the novels that want to act like the only thing that the world is a closed space, right? That there's no movement of the divine, or there's no movement of any of these things. I'll definitely take the fantastical and the mythical over that any day.
Why would you recommend it if you had a chance? I mean, I don't know what you've written on it because I haven't gotten to read your chapter, but why would you recommend people read the novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I continue to just go back to like it is such a reminder that we participate in the story of God and we participate in the story of Scripture, and this is Hurston's vision and Hurston's sort of like imagination of what that participation looks like, what we learn from that participation. In some ways, it's her corrective on some of interpretations of how we participate, but I think just the step into that world to like imagine, like, wow, like yeah, what would it be like if the enslaved people of Israel were kind of sort of mapped onto African American history and spoke the way we speak and like dealt with these sort of things. Like that step, I think, like helps us as disciples, and it forces us to, just to consider like where we would put ourselves in that story, because at the end of the day, we are going to put ourselves in some place in the story. And I think it's a good way for us to imagine that in a healthier sense. It prods us. I think if some novels like kind of outright instruct, this is like a prodding text. Like this forces us to ask the questions that I think we need to ask. And I think attached to it, because she's working with the Exodus in such close relation to African American experience, it becomes a road to consider how African Americans have participated in Scripture, which I think is instructive to the whole church.
I have two final questions for you just based on what you said. One, I was thinking about all the ways that people don't see themselves in the story, that there has been a lot of criticism that says this is more of like a blackface farce, or that she's actually making fun of African Americans in the way that she writes their dialect, unlike Jonah's Gourd, which more sympathetic with characters and more playful. And this one seems to be making fun of the character. Do you find that in the text or no?
I don't, but I would have to think about that some more. Yeah, I would have to think about that some more. I didn't sense that. But yeah, I think that's actually a good question to consider.
Yeah, whether or not people see them as
Yeah.
yeah. So, and then the second one is whether or not you think that this is a blasphemous move, these kind of retellings. A lot of Christians, when they see retellings of scripture, they go one or two ways. They'll see, that you've made a film adaptation and think that's blasphemous. You shouldn't do that to the story. You're changing the way it was written. You're taking liberties with the text. And others are, thank you for bringing it to life for me. I had stopped being able to reimagine the story.
I so maybe to a fault lean to kind of like a sympathetic reading of everything. So that's a personal problem that I have that I probably need to address and work through. But on another sense, I just think of like, I don't expect, especially if someone who's like, this is not my tradition, this is not my faith, I don't ascribe to these things. So I don't expect them to reverence these things the way I do, or the way we in the church do, though we desire that and pray for that. I do tend to lean towards like, okay, if you're going to engage with this, like what reflection does this push me to? And does that reflection push me in the direction of the faith? Does it make me return to the scriptures? And I think this is a novel that does. Like I read this and was just like, she knows, like she has really worked with the scriptures, and like she is making me go back to the scriptures. And I think if that's the sort of end impact, then it's like, okay, I can see some fruitfulness there, without discounting her own prerogative and perspective and disposition. But I can see the fruit that's coming out of that. So for that, I'm thankful, and so that's how I process that.
That's actually how I judge novels too. I'm usually more sympathetic, but I'm always trying to search for the fruit of, after this reading experience, where do I go? What do I look for? And if it has borne fruit in me, or whether it's repulsed me. I mean, there's some novels where I just kind of feel sick and gross after reading them. Like, I haven't done anything uplifting, and it doesn't have to be a feel-good story. I mean, Flannery O'Connor goes against like the instant uplift. It doesn't have to be that. But at the same time, what kind of fruit does it bear? Does it bear fruit in suffering? You feel the suffering of the characters. You understand the grit and grime in the world. But you see this ray of hope, or you see this. There's a comedic end to the story. There's a happy ending even after the novel's closed or not. Right. And for Hurston, I feel like the story ends, but you still have that sense that there's a truth to look for and to find will be liberating. Right.
Yes, that's well said.
So tell people about your book before we close out. Just what's it going to be, and where can we find it? What's the title?
Talking Books, a theological reading of African American literature. So that'll probably shift and change, at least the subtitle probably, if not the title outright. But so I'm just working with great African American novelists, or writers rather, of the 20th century. So Baldwin, Wright, Morrison, Hurston, and just kind of reading their stories through the lens of faith, like how those novels, how those themes, how those writers push us to ask deeper, harder questions, and in asking those things, to show the fullness of the beauty of our faith tradition in general, but obviously with specifics towards African American Christianity. So I hope it's a book that just helps people, one, read these authors and read them better, but read them better in a way that enriches our discipleship in the world.
Yeah. And are you doing Butler, Whitehead? Like, are you going up?
No. I'm not. I'm focused 20th century. Yeah. So the classic people that I feel like I personally kind of have engaged with and know the best. And so maybe yeah, maybe if this turns out okay and is fruitful for people, maybe that would be, another time around would be to work with
Yeah.
some more immediate contemporary authors.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you for spending the time. I really appreciate taking out of time, your church schedule, your real life.
No, it's an honor. Great to talk with you on these things, and really, yeah, really love your work and really excited for your book to enter into the world.
Thank you. I look forward to promoting yours. It's going to be fun.
Well, great to connect with you. Thanks so much.